The next 2 weeks, we're going to do something a little unusual. We're going to take 2 Sunday mornings and we're going to try to look at the main topics, the main stories that make up our Holy Scripture. Today, we're going to look at the First Testament or the Old Testament, and that's 2/3 of the Bible. So be patient. There's a lot of information. And then next week, we'll get to the more familiar stories of the New Testament. So I hope you'll join with me. Lots of information to get through. We're going to try to do this in a way that you can hear these stories, and as we begin to tie these stories that are so important to us in our journey as faithful people. Let's begin our time together today. I want to take some time to look at the Bible as a record of God's people in relationship with God and each other over time. It would be very easy to preach a series of sermons on every book of the Bible and also spend significant time on how the Bible came to be in its current form, looking at the people and the councils that formed it. However, what I'm going to do is a brief overview of the Bible, first the Old Testament and then the New. The Old Testament, referred to as the First Testament of the Hebrew Bible, but for our purposes, I will refer to it as the Old. Also, we could spend significant time on the books that didn't make it into the Bible. Some are found in the Apocrypha or Deuterocanonical books, and are books that are held out as informative, but not at the same level as the canonized books, those found in our Bible. We could look at those books which did not make either category, as they are seen as dramatic departures from the truth found in the included books. These books, sometimes referred to as the lost books of the Bible, include the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Judas and a whole collection of other Gospels and writings. Our task today is to take a very brief look at some of the major characters and events that make up the Old Testament. We'll have to leave a lot out, but hopefully this will serve as a reminder of how the stories fit chronologically and how some of the familiar people related to those events lived their lives out. By the way, we'll pay little attention to most of the work of the minor prophets, which holds helpful material but does not contain much of the backbone of the Old Testament tradition. So here we go. The Bible opens by telling that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and that everything God made was good. If you look closely, you will discover that chapters 1 and 2 actually contain 2 creation stories. Sin, or the concept of evil, enters the story when human beings want to become like God and disobey God's command by eating fruit that God had told them not to eat. The effects of sin became evident when one man slays his brother out of anger toward God. Violence multiplies until God determines to purge the earth by a flood, and God commanded Noah to build a boat that could preserve animals from every species of destruction. After the flood, God put the rainbow in the sky to assure people that he would not destroy the earth again, and as we know, the boat came to rest in northern Kentucky. Sin persisted, however, and people sought to make themselves equal to God by building a tower that could reach to heaven. God responded by making people speak different languages so they could no longer understand each other, and they scattered over the face of the earth. A new phase of the story begins when God calls a man named Abraham, who lived in the area near the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, modern-day Iraq and Syria. God told Abraham to go to a land that God would show him, promising that Abraham would have many descendants and that all the nations of the earth would be blessed through him. Abraham responded to God's call, and with Sarah, his wife, he finally settled in the land of Canaan, modern-day Palestine or Israel. There they tended their flocks and herds. The period was about 2000 to 1700 BC. Abraham and Sarah became old and had no kids. God granted Abraham a son through Hagar, Sarah's slave girl. His name was Ishmael. In one of the great stories of the Bible, God then gave Abraham and Sarah a son in their very old age, whose name was Isaac. At this point, Hagar and Ishmael, blessed by God, departed, and Ishmael became the founder of a new movement, the religion of Islam. Isaac in turn had two sons, Jacob and Esau. By means of trickery, Jacob obtained a special blessing from his father. When his brother Esau became angry, Jacob fled to the home of an uncle, where he married and became wealthy before returning to Canaan. Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel, had 12 sons. But because of family rivalry, his son Joseph was sold as a slave and taken to Egypt. There, Joseph managed to become a high-ranking official, and when famine drove the rest of the family into Egypt, the brothers became reconciled and settled there permanently. The descendants of Jacob, who are called Hebrews or children of Israel, continued to live in Egypt from about 1700 to 1275 BC. During that time, they were enslaved by the Egyptians and forced to make bricks and mortar. A Hebrew named Moses saw an Egyptian beating one of his kinsmen. Moses killed the Egyptian and fled to the desert regions of Egypt. There he was called by God to return to Egypt and to deliver his people from slavery. Israel's deliverance from Egypt is commonly known as the Exodus and is one of the pivotal events in the Old Testament. The biblical account says that Moses returned to Egypt and told the king that the Hebrew people must be freed. And when the king of Egypt refused, the Egyptians were afflicted with various plagues. The water of the Nile River became foul, frogs and insects multiplied, and diseases and darkness made life miserable for the Egyptians. Finally, after the firstborn children and animals of each Egyptian household suddenly died, the Egyptians momentarily relented, and the people of Israel fled eastward by night. The Egyptians pursued them, but the Israelites escaped recapture by miraculously crossing a sea while the Egyptian chariots were swept away by the water. The people of Israel began their new life of freedom by remaining in the desert regions east of Egypt for about 40 years, from approximately 1275 to 1235 BC. The central event of this period was establishing a covenantal relationship between God and Israel at Mount Sinai. The covenant reminded the people that it was God who had brought them out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. This is in Exodus 22. And it called upon them to honor God alone and reject the deities of the other nations. The primary provisions of this covenant, known as the Ten Commandments, became Israel's charter as a nation. After departing from Mount Sinai, the people gradually moved north and east into what is now the Kingdom of Jordan. The generation that escaped out of Egypt, including Moses himself, died out as the people of Israel approached the Jordan River and prepared to enter the land of Canaan once again. The details of Israel's entry into the land are unclear, but the biblical account suggests that conquest began around 1235 BC under the leadership of Joshua. Military victories apparently helped Israel to gain possession of part of the land, but the westward movement of the Israelites was halted by the Philistines, who held sizable portions of the country. For generations, the 12 tribes of Israel led a precarious existence in Canaan, often subjugated by neighboring peoples until a leader arose to liberate them. One of these leaders or judges was Deborah, a prophetess who led the people to victory over the Canaanites. Another judge was the strong man Samson, who fraternized with Philistine women and then avenged himself against the Philistine villages when the relationships turned sour. The continued threat of being dominated by other nations finally led the people of Israel to clamor for a king who could lead them. Samuel, the last of the judges, designated a man named Saul as Israel's first king. Saul was tall and a handsome man who was sometimes swept up into spiritual ecstasy. Soon after becoming king, Saul demonstrated his ability by leading the Israelite army to victory. But later, Saul was plagued by sharp mood swings, possibly manic depressive, and became jealous of the popularity enjoyed by David, a promising young man from Bethlehem who was a member of his court. David fled for his life, lived as the leader of an outlaw band at the periphery of the country until Saul was wounded in battle and committed suicide. David became king about 1000 BC and ushered in Israel's golden age. He helped to unify Israel by capturing the city of Jerusalem, which was in the middle of the country, and making it his capital. Under David's leadership, a series of successful military campaigns secured Israel's borders against the neighboring peoples. And one of David's own sons tried to seize his throne, driving him into temporary exile. But David managed to regain power. Another son named Solomon was designated as David's successor. Solomon's outstanding achievement was the construction of a temple in Jerusalem, which became the religious as well as the political center of the country. International commerce was expanded, the arts flourished, and an opulent palace was built for the king. To carry out his building project, Solomon enslaved some of the non-Israelite peoples within his realm. And to secure his political position, he entered into several foreign alliances. He sealed these pacts by marrying women from the various allied peoples, and he permitted shrines to foreign deities in Jerusalem, even though worship of other gods had traditionally been condemned in Israel. After Solomon died, his son Rehoboam ruled harshly, and the kingdom split into two in 922 BC. The northern part was still called Israel. The southern part was called Judah. And relationships between the two kingdoms shifted between uneasy coexistence and open hostility. The northern kingdom entered into close relationships with the nations to the north, and the worship of the god Baal and the goddess Astarte became common. The prophet Elijah protested the worship of these deities and challenged the priests of Baal to demonstrate the power of their gods by calling down fire from heaven. When they were unable to do so, Elijah prayed to the God of Israel, and fire fell from heaven, and Elijah's followers slaughtered the prophets of Baal. That's in 1 Kings 18. In the 8th century BC, the prophets Amos and Hosea joined the protest against the idolatrous and unjust practices of the northern kingdom. And finally, in 721 BC, the army of Assyria, a powerful nation to the northeast, conquered the northern kingdom of Israel and exiled its leaders. Meanwhile, the southern kingdom of Judah also struggled with issues of idolatry and injustice. The oppressive practices of Judah's leaders were denounced by prophets such as Micah, who came from a village in the foothills, and Isaiah, a resident of Jerusalem. Some reforms were undertaken by King Hezekiah in the late 8th century BC, but his successors reverted to patterns of corruption. The prophet Jeremiah, who came from a priestly family, railed against Israel's attraction to foreign cults, some of which included child sacrifice. He warned that if Judah did not repent, it would be devastated like the northern kingdom had been. Major reforms were made in the late 7th century BC during the reign of King Josiah. Pagan practices were rejected and worship was centralized at Jerusalem. But in the decades after Josiah's death, the Babylonians brought Judean sovereignty to an end. The Babylonians destroyed the Jerusalem temple in 586 BC. Judah's leading citizens were exiled to Babylonia, far to the northeast, leaving only a remnant in the country. The Babylonian exile was one of the great crises in Israel's history. People questioned how God could permit the brutal destruction of Jerusalem and the loss of Israel's homeland. Nevertheless, the prophet Ezekiel told the exiles that even though Israel seemed as lifeless as a field of dry bones, God would revitalize the people and take them home again. That's in Ezekiel 37. A turning point came when Cyrus, king of Persia, conquered Babylonia. In 538 BC, Cyrus declared that the exiles, now known as Judeans or Jews, could return to their country. Some of these exiles chose to remain in Babylonia, but others returned and began the slow task of reconstruction. Urged on by prophets such as Haggai and Zechariah, whose writings appear in the Old Testament, the people eventually established a new temple and rebuilt Jerusalem. The scribes Ezra and Nehemiah called for renewed commitment to the laws and traditions of Israel that were being assembled into the form in which we now have them in the Pentateuch. That's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Together, the temple and the law became the two institutions that gave the people their distinct identity while living under Persian domination. A significant change began when Alexander the Great swept down from Macedonia and Greece to conquer Palestine in 330 BC. Alexander envisioned a grand world city in which people would not belong primarily to a given tribe or local community, but to the Greek Empire. This new vision of one world city differed significantly from the conviction that Israel was God's chosen people. Some of the Jewish people liked the new vision. They began adopting Greek customs, but others rebelled and insisted that to do so would be to commit apostasy. The governor of that region tried to suppress the revolt by forbidding observance of Israel's laws and by turning the Jerusalem temple into a shrine that he dedicated to Zeus in 167 BC. A group of Jews led by Judah Maccabee successfully recaptured the temple and purified it in 164 BC. And soon they regained control of their country and set up their own government. The first independent government since Jerusalem had been conquered by the Babylonians 400 years earlier. This Jewish kingdom endured for a century. In 63 BC, a Roman general conquered Jerusalem and brought Jewish independence to an end. The Romans eventually designated a man named Herod to rule Palestine. An ambitious and masterful politician, Herod accommodated devout Jews by transforming the modern Jerusalem temple, the modest Jerusalem temple that had been rebuilt after the exile, into an imposing structure of gleaming white limestone adorned with gold. At the same time, he built cities named for Caesar Augustus that contained stadiums, theaters, and temples to the emperor. Okay, in a nutshell, there is the Old Testament. Next week, we will do a similar overview of the New Testament. Have a great week and stay safe.